If Medieval 2 had been made today, it would have been slaughtered for its insane historical inaccuracies. There are many obvious ones, but truth be told, the least obvious are perhaps the most long-term egregious ones. And listen, I want to make something clear. This video is in no way intended to scold the developers of this game who made it back in 2005. I completely understand how development deadlines, budget limits, and most important of all, markets and target audiences determine mostly everything about what and why something is included in your game, or not. And even though I love Medieval 2 Total War with a passion, it is also the prime example on how to not portray history. Let me put it this way. Perhaps the most historically accurate faction in Medieval 2 is arguably the Byzantine Empire. And I say this because the Roman system kind of kept churning here. And as opposed to the Western European kingdoms, for example, the Byzantine system of government is perhaps the one that resembles the unitary and single entity format of Total War the most. And if we dare to skip across the horrendously depicted France, which at this point in time was more of a conglomerate of a French king and his numerous vassals and allies, the opposite end of the Byzantine Empire is arguably the Holy Roman Empire. Playing Medieval 2 as a kid, I had never even heard of this entity and had no understanding of why a Roman Empire was suddenly located in Germany. Anyway, the Holy Roman Empire was only very briefly a unified empire as is shown in Medieval 2, and this was about 200 to 300 years before the events of this game. In fact, it was arguably the most complex non-empire empire in history, with hundreds of counts and dukes and even kings who were more or less loyal to the emperor and more or less decentralized to the point where when Germany finally became a single state about 800 years after this game begins, it had demanded massive wars and the unification of older Holy Roman Empire entities. What I'm trying to say here is that even on the most basic and upper levels, Medieval 2 is filled with inaccuracies and blatant disregard for actual history. But in my opinion, and the reason for this video, is an even more dangerous error, one that has a much more profound impact on how we see the world. And to me, that is Medieval 2's portrayal of the conflicts and meeting points between Christianity and Islam, and most importantly, how this played out in Iberia. In Medieval 2, the first thing you'll notice is that Iberia is only really occupied by three factions: Spain, Portugal, and the Moors. And if you know your history, a few alarm bells should be ringing quite loudly right now. First of all, Spain as a unified kingdom would not really come to be for another 400 years at the earliest, and was at this time a relatively far-off fantasy. On the upper levels, Christian Iberia was at varying times in fact made up of several kingdoms, among them Leon, Castile, Navarre, and Aragon in the north and east, and the Kingdom of Portugal in the west, which didn't really exist at the beginning of Medieval 2's time frame, but which is represented here, only came to be in the 12th century. Not only is this wildly anachronistic then, but it simplifies the diverse Christian presence in Iberia. But what is much worse is the treatment of the Muslim presence there, represented only by the faction of the Moors. While it is true that the Muslim presence and the domination of Iberia in Medieval 2's time frame was slowly on the decline, it was still very much present in the first few centuries, and the future of the peninsula was in no way determined. The Moors as such represent this conflict of civilizations, if you will then, but it does so extremely poorly. Not only is the name the Moors insulting to history, as it was mostly used by Europeans as a catch-all term for Muslims in Iberia, North Africa, and Sicily, but just like the Christians, the Muslims were after the fall of Al-Andalus never a single entity faction either. Muslim Spain was in fact extremely diverse, with numerous local and more powerful lords in charge of different cities and regions. Not only was it not just one kingdom, but more than just being Muslim, the ethnicity and culture of these lords also mattered. And what's interesting is that not only did both Christian and Muslim lords fight other Christian and Muslim lords, but they even served each other and worked within each other's governments. Very much unlike Northern Europe, Iberia was something of a melting pot of cultures and faiths, and whereas much of Medieval 2 portrays the relationship between Christian and Muslim factions as a war of religion and civilization, in these meeting places between the two faiths, interfaith relations were arguably at their warmest. Even though the Moors in Medieval 2 only really controls the southern tip of the peninsula, we can see that Creative Assembly at least tried in certain instances to represent religious diversity. There are quite a few rebel cities in Iberia, and if we use our priests to check out the region's religious diversity, we can see that there is in fact quite a lot of diversity here. But sadly, this really is mostly just for show and leads to nothing, as Christian factions in Medieval 2 can only hire Christian generals and build Christian-themed buildings, and vice versa goes for the Muslim factions. It's worth noting that in many of these rebel cities, Muslim lords would in fact be the rulers, albeit with Christian and Jewish statesmen, advisors, courtiers, and even generals. In fact, the same would go for Sicily, although in the next century, the situation would be quite the opposite. Once the Kingdom of Sicily was founded, the island still had a massive Muslim population, but instead of driving them out, the King of Sicily in the 12th century wholeheartedly embraced a kind of Arabo-Byzantine culture, and even though he was formerly a Christian, likely held very favorable views of Islam. The fact that the arguably closest ally of Sicily during this era was the Fatimid Caliph of Egypt tells us how intertwined some of these cultures actually were, and that in fact, most of what drove the rulers in the border regions of this era was power and not faith. And as such, it is in my opinion a massive shame how little diversity Medieval 2 offers in terms of intra-Christian and intra-Muslim opportunities, but also in their dealings with each other. Take perhaps the most legendary historical general in Medieval 2. And no, he doesn't belong to any playable faction at all, but is in fact a rebel general. You can find him in Iberia, in the castle of Valencia, namely Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, or, as he's better known, El Cid. El Cid has been characterized as a hero of Christendom and as an early paragon of the Spanish Reconquista, especially by the medieval Catholic Church and Spanish nationalists. In reality, he's much more colorful, having led both Christian and Muslim armies to victory numerous times, and being an important player in Iberian politics. While it is fun to have him cameo as a rebel general in Medieval 2, which I suppose is meant to signify his independent nature, he does very much symbolize this trend in Medieval 2 of vastly simplifying what actually happened. In comparison to what I find the main problem to be though, El Cid is a minor complaint. Because as much as it can be both exciting and scary to admit, I really do think video games can have a great impact on our understanding of history, at least in the most general terms. And in Medieval 2, in my interpretation at least, the general overtone is that Catholics are more or less always opposed to Muslims and vice versa, even though it is of course possible to have friendly diplomatic ties. But there is really nothing here to suggest that there were any type of intermingling whatsoever. And even though this could be more true for Northern Europe, or faraway Muslim lands, in the border regions like Iberia and Sicily, it very much wasn't. In Medieval 2, there is for example no evidence of Mozarabs of Iberia for example, the Christians who adopted Arabic clothing, styles and language, and because we have literally nothing to suggest such overtures, our game and understanding of history becomes much more binary and simple than it actually was and should be. And from this, wildly inaccurate ideas about what the past actually was may form and lead to other negative consequences. Of course, Medieval 2 is now an 18-year-old game, but I think many of the same problems can be found in later titles. In an almost perfect example, the Charlemagne campaign for Medieval 2 portrays an early medieval era, partially taking place in Iberia, with not that much more complexity. I will wholeheartedly commend the steps taken, however, because Iberia in Age of Charlemagne is much more representative of history than Medieval 2 ever was. Not only do we have the Emirate of Cordoba leading Al-Andalus as its dominant power, but we have several Muslim Taifa rulers surrounding it, staking their own claims as lords. Indeed, Total War continues in positive ways with the only way it knows how to portray diversity within states, namely a percentage makeup of religions, and it's nice to see that even in deep Al-Andalus territory, there is often a majority Christian population, and even a large Jewish one. But other than better top-down representation, there honestly isn't much to go on here. Intra-faction politics works very much in the same way, with either all Christian or all Muslim government members, agents, and generals. And whereas in real life, where the Islamic kingdoms had a very important dhimmi population, meaning non-Muslims who could still live and work, this factor is basically non-existent in both Medieval 2 long ago and this newer iteration of the early medieval period. And indeed, even though they on a whole were treated a bit worse than in their Islamic counterparts, minority religion populations in certain Christian kingdoms were extremely important and treated as near equals as well. But there is nothing to suggest this in Total War. What I think Total War needs to do in a possible Medieval 3 is look to Paradox, and specifically Crusader Kings 3, which does something extremely interesting. First of all, as is clear from the get-go, CK3 is filled to the brim with factions and indeed doing so in a very historical way, not just by splitting up Iberia for example, in so many different Christian and Muslim states, but seeing as the game's nature necessitates granularity, we also have lower level dukes and counts making up much of the diversity in rulership. Indeed, it's actually possible for characters of various faiths to coexist within the same faction, and thanks to the Fate of Iberia DLC, to even intermarry. But what I find to be even more fantastic is CK3's cultural system, and most of all, the ability to create divergent cultures. In essence, every culture in CK3 has traits and modifiers to them, which in a very real sense in-game makes them different. i.e. Castilian culture, is different and will lend you a slightly different experience than Arabic culture. But by diverging or making your own culture, it's actually possible to do what some rulers and peoples did in real life, namely to effectively create ascended cultures that derive important features from several places. In Sicily, King Roger II was, for example, a man who made extensive use of Muslims in his court and administration, and showed much love, much respect for Arab culture. Indeed, in one of the most famous portrayals of him, he's being blessed by Jesus Christ as he himself wears regal Byzantine garbs, when he himself, of course, was Norman Latin. This is a reality very far from what Total War manages to portray, especially seeing as Roger wasn't just officially Catholic, but he wasn't even really ethnically Italian. He was Norman, essentially a mix between Viking and Frankish. But in Crusader Kings, making a culture and playing a man or woman of not just one mind is very possible. And I commend the efforts made by Paradox to make not just the grand politics more accurate, but also to make the medieval way of life seem a lot more diverse, complex, and interesting. The Crusades did indeed change a lot of what it meant to be Christian and Muslim in many regions in the year that followed the 11th century starting dates of these games. But since these are games, it doesn't necessarily have to mean much for the player. As the kings, emirs, emperors, and caliphs of old, it should be up to us to decide what we do with our cultures and nations, rather than being limited to a historically inaccurate portrayal of the times. It's been clear that Total War players and modders for a long time have been clamoring for deeper mechanics and more fun ways of playing, which is perfectly exemplified by the existence of Medieval Kingdoms 1212, the amazing overhaul for Total War Attila that essentially creates a Medieval 3 on its own. Here, as far as the Total War engine can handle thus far, the modders are lifting it up to something of a Crusader Kings-like level, with so many more factions and portrayals than Medieval 2 ever did, even giving us a Holy Roman Empire that's actually fractured and with imperial elections. My point is that the fans want and even crave this historical depth, even to the point where they spend their lives making it themselves on their own time, and going back to Crusader Kings again, despite being so much more complex than Total War ever was, is also so extremely popular, even years after launch. And here I am, spending my time and pouring my heart out trying to convince you that in the long term, historical accuracy, depth, and a commitment to fun always pays off. So get off your asses, Creative Assembly, and announce a Medieval 3 already.